I mean, I think that one of the things about, since the book is interested in kind of the possibilities of collective feeling, that one thing that a sense of imminent disaster does is produces, however briefly, a kind of collectivity. Like, I was just really interested in how, like, as a hurricane approached New York, all these changes in social space would take place, where you could start kind of talking to neighbors who you otherwise didn't talk to, or when you were on the train, you could, like, kind of all the different partitions between people socially start to break down. So there's always this kind of utopian moment involved in the prospect of imminent catastrophe. And so I think in both novels, there's this sense that when there's some kind of historical event, like whether it's an attack or the prospect of a natural disaster, that there's something to think through about the brief sense of collective possibility that emerges. So that's part of it. But I also think that, you know, there are plenty of reasons to feel a fragility to the present now. And the kind of texture of contemporary vulnerability is something I wanted to think about in 1004. So, like, for the narrator in the 80s, there was just like a sense of, there was this, like, the narrator of this book grew up in this kind of end of history moment for the United States, when it was just thought that there was this kind of like unchecked imperial triumph of capitalism, you know, which was of course, you know, wrong. And that now there's this sense both of vertigo and possibility that attends a feeling of the fragility of capital, and the ecological, you know, linked to that, the ecological fragility of the city. So that I think that is the collective version of, like, Nor learning that her father isn't her father. It's kind of like, so when the collective fictions start to fade or shimmer or fissure, like that's an opportunity for fiction to think through, you know, alternative modes of thought and feeling. But certainly it's a modernist, I mean, it's a very traditional modernist project in the sense of art being made in a moment of crisis, or the idea that art has to produce a kind of structure against the total chaos of metaphysical despair or collapsing civilization or whatever. And so it's traditional in that regard. But I'm trying to get at all the kind of absurdity and humor, but also possibility and violence that is the outrageous inequality of a contemporary New York. So I think, you know, and I also think structurally the two storms in the novel are kind of like the two 1004s, right? I mean, that everything happens twice in the novel. And the epigraph in the novel about, you know, the world to come being like this one, but just a little different, that Benjamin was so fond of, kind of structures the novel in different ways. This idea that everything returns with a little difference, either apocalyptically or in some redemptive form across the book. Yeah, I mean, I think that well, I mean, generally speaking, I think literature is this weird mix of impossibly high ambition and total frivolity. And I think that kind of characterizes the narrator's attitude towards what he's doing, right? I mean, when he talks about being like a kind of Whitman of the vulnerable grid, he doesn't actually believe that he can achieve this kind of fantasy of dissolving himself into a moment of collective possibility. So he's ironic about it in the sense that he thinks it's basically a doomed project, and kind of like, who is he to attempt it? And on the other hand, he takes, like, really seriously the idea that's an important ambition for literature, even if it's not realizable in literature. That idea of trying to create a space for the transpersonal. So you know, irony is often a moment in sincerity. So, for example, like one of the things the book does, that the narrator of the book often tries to do, is tries to think about how bad forms of collectivity could be signs for its real possibility. So it's ironic in the sense that you have to ironize that image in order to make it a sign of possibility. But it's not ironic in the sense of detachment. It's not ironic in the sense of just, disavowing the project that he states for himself. It's ironic in the sense that he thinks you have to find in the fallen forms of interconnection that exist now negative images of what real community would look like. So he's kind of kidding about like how trace amounts of antidepressants in the water could be a sign of social possibility, but he's also not kidding. So I think the irony, I think that the bad irony in the kind of vernacular of literary journalism just means kind of like not caring, right? Like it'd be like, but irony in the more serious sense, I think, is really crucial to what literature can do, to clearing a space for sincerity. And that that kind of irony is also about it's formal, right? I mean, it's about kind of dissolving content into an experience of form. I mean, certainly he matters to me, and the way he uses images matters to me, but it's no more a reference to him than to say Alexander Kluge, a German writer who's meant a lot to me, or Javier Marias uses images in a quieter way, but in some of his books that I like a lot. Or even in the kind of founding novels, there weren't photographs, obviously, but I think of like drawings in Tristram Shandy. I think about photographs in the work of John Berger, like in A Fortunate Man. Or, so, for me, we live in a world where what passes for the public sphere is largely constituted by images, and people are often kind of proclaiming the death of literature relative to the dominance of the image. And I understand that in a certain sense, but what using images in the novel can do in part is remind us of how deeply context-dependent images are. So I like how an image can change its valences and significances depending upon how it's positioned relative to the text. I also just like that it relieves the prose of a certain kind of burden of conventional realism, because it kind of says the photographs can do the work of kind of describing what faces look like or whatever. But there's also a way in which a lot of this book is interested in looking. Like it talks about the narrator and kind of the core emotional relationship between the narrator and this woman, Alex. It talks about how they always have parallel gazes, or how they would have their conversations while looking at a painting at the museum. And I like that when you have an image in a book, you can have the characters and the reader look at it at the same time, so that it becomes a way that character and reader can have a simultaneous experience. So that, for example, in the story, when they're looking at the image of this rock formation on Mars, in which people often see a face, so it's an image that's being used to describe how we see faces when they're not there. I mean, it's kind of already talking about realism or readerly projection to a certain degree. But they're looking at this image on a cell phone in the time of the story, and the reader is also looking at the image on the page in the time of the reading, and so there's a correspondence, a temporal correspondence or simultaneity between reader and writer, and that's and character. And the book's very concerned with that sort of possibility, that brief alignment of different experiences of time. So images are another way to do that. It's like the reader gets to look over the author's shoulder, who gets to look over the character's shoulder, all at the same time. Seeing, like when I look at a painting, part of what I'm looking at, or part of what I experience when I look at the painting, is this whole history of other people looking at it this idea that we're looking together, even if we're not coeval. That like generations looking at the same painting is a way that everyone kind of gets to be present. All those different gazes become a kind of like lacquer on the painting, and so you look, but you're also looking with others.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of the things I want to do with images in the fiction. Back to the Future is an amazing film if you think about it as a collective fantasy.
Of course.
I mean, it's a film it's a really bizarre film, right? I mean, like it involves all these imaginaries. Like, first of all, it's an Oedipal drama where Michael J. Fox has to like deny the sexual advances of his mother so that he can get his parents together so he can be born. It's very Greek. And then there are all these things like he teaches Chuck Berry how to play rock and roll, basically. So it's like this white suburban kid goes back in time to invent an African-American cultural form that white people have in fact appropriated. So it's not like formally great cinema, but it's hugely rich and dense and influential as a kind of mythology of the white suburbs in the 80s, and a lot of it's, so it's a collective fiction with a lot of force, even if it's also kind of silly or whatever. And one of the other things about Back to the Future is there's a moment in Back to the Future where Michael J. Fox is trying to prove to Christopher Lloyd that he's from the future, and Christopher Lloyd says, "Who's president in the future?" And Michael J. Fox says Ronald Reagan, and Christopher Lloyd is like, "Oh yeah, right, that lousy actor is president." Like it was the first moment where I started to see as a kid. That's when I learned that Ronald Reagan had been an actor. Where I saw this, to my mind, ultimately disastrous intersection of Hollywood spectacle and American politics was also kind of announced in that film. And then, as the last quote in the book kind of shows, Ronald Reagan, after the Challenger disaster, quoted Back to the Future. So it's for the narrator, the Challenger disaster, Back to the Future, the Reagan presidency, that moment of American political history are all fantasized in that film. Well, I mean, not in some sense that there's nothing that's true.
No, of course.
But only in the sense that, what we do to make sense of a world that doesn't really in and of itself make sense is try to produce these tentative structures of signification, and that there's no, it's kind of narrative all the way down. It's fiction all the way down. I mean, so in this sense, it's much more like the definition of like fiction, like as Wallace Stevens thought about fiction. It's not like fiction as a genre of literature, but fiction as the power of the mind to organize reality into a certain kind of narrative coherence. And so, certain fictions are hugely dangerous and destructive, and some are more fecund. So I certainly think that there's no way to talk about the world without producing a fiction. I mean, it's like Donald Trump's fiction, barely coherent fiction about the world, but which is a really dominant fiction now, which is just basically the fiction of angry white disenfranchisement, a kind of reverse racialization of white people. Like, we did everything right, and this has kind of been taken away from us by immigrants, and that's like a very common political fiction that has disastrous consequences. And the question is kind of like, what are the alternative fictions that will be produced that can encourage more just orders of human association? So on every level, the individual and the collective, I think it's always a question of fiction, but some fictions are better than others. Well, Trump is really interesting because it's almost this post-semantic language. It's almost like it's a post-truth discourse. It's fiction in that sense. Like, it just verifiability has nothing to do with it. But really what he's communicating or appealing to is people who just think that the language of American politics itself is totally bankrupt and emptied of meaning. I mean, that's the moment of truth of Trump politics, is that he, by refusing to make any kind of sense, he speaks the truth of the bankruptcy of that language. But that's hardly a reason to support him.
Of course.
I mean, I'm really interested in the novel as a kind of ekphrastic form, or a kind of curatorial form. Like for me, in both books, the way that the novel can absorb other works of art or dramatize encounters with other works of art is really a crucial part of its power. That kind of elasticity of the novel really attracts me. And since I'm a poet and a lot of my thinking is either about or through poetics, I just really love how the novel can both contain poetry, and the way that the language of poetry, once it's in the novel, can start to kind of inflect and infect other dimensions of the composition. So, I mean, I think of the novel as a really fine vehicle for poetry criticism, but also generally as a really great form for thinking about how we interact with artworks and what the social possibilities are of interactions with artworks, or how even depicting encounters with artworks can be a technology of characterization. Like what a character sees when he goes and looks at a particular painting can be a really rich way of showing a collision between personal and social histories, for example. So part of it is that it's like having other artworks in the novel becomes a technical solution for the story I want to tell. Like it can be an implement of characterization. But a lot of it is that precisely what the novel is for me is a kind of literary form that can contain and meditate on other forms, literary, visual, critical, whatever. So I think maybe I'll write a novel at some point that doesn't have poetry in it, but I can't imagine writing a novel that doesn't use the specific gifts of the novel to talk about other media and technology and artworks. And certainly the novels that have meant the most to me always involve some kind of ekphrastic element, you know, whether it's Proust talking about music, or Proust talks about like the telephone or another technology. It's showing the way that these objects that are dense with history and have their own kind of projected social fictions, like how we interact with them. So I think of the novel as really ekphrastic and curatorial and elastic and capable of assimilating these other kinds of work. And I think that's kind of why I think the novel is a live technology. I mean, I think that the novel, when it's at its most radical, is always flickering on a kind of edge between the poetic and the prosaic. Like, I think that's what the form is when it's really alive. And that you know, the novel gets a charge also from always combining the kind of fact and fiction. Like that's the other thing the novel already, you know, what happens when you kind of make up a composite character but you have him wandering around a real Paris in the 1920s or whatever. That so that to a certain degree, a lot of the things that kind of journalistic critics keep saying is like characteristic of writing now, you know, like autofiction or blurring the boundary between fact and fiction. I mean, to me, that's kind of what the novel has always been. But I think that the the boundary between the poetry and prose is a way of kind of talking about a mixture between mundane experience and the sense of moments of significance crystallizing out of that white noise. And to me, the thing that the novel can do, and poetry, you know, other art forms can do it too, but one of the things I really love about the novel is the way that it has that background and foreground relation as you read, that sometimes you're kind of experiencing time pass in the mundane rhythm of exposition, and then at other times there's a kind of crystallization of linguistic intensity, which may or may not also be a moment of intensity in the plot. So I guess I just think of that, I think almost every medium that I care about is most alive when it's operating along the edge, right? I don't know if that's a good answer. I mean, but it is certainly true that the thing the narrator says about the way genre is thought of in relation to poetry, where fact and fiction is less important than the intensity of the experience disclosed in the act of reading, right? That to me does seem to be, that's like, to me, when I read a book, I mean, genre is something that's performed, right? When a book asks you to read it as a novel or as nonfiction or as poetry, it's an invitation to read with a certain kind of expectations. And then those expectations can be strategically fulfilled or disappointed to literary effect. So genre matters to me in that sense. You perform a genre. It's a frame. It's a set of expectations that you work with. But I am much more interested in the kinds of thinking and feeling that can happen in the work independent of it being assigned to fact or to fiction. Yeah, I mean, for me, that density of built space, it just means that you're always, I mean, there are always many different orders of time. Like when you walk down a street, you're walking across many different centuries. And so the city's always haunted. And a city is a huge architectural, I mean, the city is both one organism and it's the history of like countless individual decisions. So the city for me is a place where the mind can really like stare itself out. It's also a place where contradictions are exacerbated by proximity. So like in New York, you can take a short walk and be in places of outrageous wealth that coexist with moments of extreme desperation. So a walk in the city becomes a literary way of depicting a whole cross-section of experience. But yeah, I mean, you know, New York is also, it's, even though it's undergoing a huge process of standardization and finance has so remade the city in its own image, it's still a place where the energies I care about in the culture feel most alive for me. So, you know, there's that, and then there's the fact that, you know, it does have a different kind of vulnerability. Or I mean, kind of independent of the question of its objective vulnerability, New York is a place where, like a lot of cities, there's a new sense of it being at threat for ecological reasons or at threat because, you know, because of terrorism or whatever. So in a novel that's so much about different imaginations of the future, I think that like, and New York is in this kind of constant flux, of course. New York in the novel is both a place that's kind of threatened by the sameness of a capitalist standardization on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, destruction from superstorms or the once-in-a-generation weather that keeps arriving every, you know, 6 months or something. So it's a mixture of vulnerability, but it's also about what's vulnerable. And what's vulnerable is this tremendously dense, intergenerational, collaborative, murderous, beautiful project. You know, I don't really know how to write a novel. I haven't tried to write a novel that's not set in a city yet, because for me, so much of the novel is in that kind of like Whitmanic way, like what you can, like what, like the multitudes that you interact with by virtue, or that you try to avoid interacting with, you know, in certain instances, or that you deny in order to function in the city, just when you traverse it. But, you know, built space has always had a power for me that natural space hasn't. Marfa.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because his big experience there is of the minimalist art.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, you know, there's the kind of common fact of how much my literary heroes at one point or another have been located in New York or thought of in New York. Also, my mom, even though I grew up in Kansas, my mom is from Brooklyn. So I also have this, you know, there's a kind of natal history there for me too. Oh yeah. I mean, I think that I don't think we need another book that gives us reasons to feel melancholy about the possibility of art. I think you start, you know, or at least I start from a perspective that in an era of, in an era of such unbelievable inequality and crisis and the immiseration of so many parts of the human population, that you start with the idea that there's every reason not to take art seriously. And the question to a certain degree is how you manage simultaneously to acknowledge the privilege and the distance from certain realities of the artwork and its ineffectuality compared to other forces in the world, and also at the same time figure out a way to capture something vital about the imaginative capacity and our ability to exercise faculties that aren't just the faculties we exercise when we go shopping. Yeah. Well, you know, I've always thought that what it feels like to write fiction for me is like, you know, the experience when you're trying to tell someone a dream and you're kind of remembering it, but at a certain point you realize you're kind of making it up too. I mean, it's not that you're even lying. Although as a kid, I used to lie all the time about my dreams. Actually, when I would talk to he would say, "What did you dream?" and I'd start to kind of make up this whole story. It authorized the space for fiction. And now I do that with my daughters. I ask her if she remembers her dreams, and she starts telling these stories that I don't think have anything to do with what she dreamt. But that feeling, as you recount the dream, that like you're remembering and then it's shading into composition, it's shading into the construction of something that you're not remembering, that for me is a feeling very associated with writing fiction, where it feels like remembering, even if it's a kind of projection. I mean, in that moment in the novel, so it is for me generally a lot of like what kind of composition is like. That part of the novel, you know, he's talking about this thing where he took a drug to have his wisdom teeth out, and the drug he was told that the drug would make it impossible it would induce amnesia. So he takes this drive home, this, you know, kind of hopped up on these drugs with a sore mouth, and he's watching the like beautiful skyline. And the beauty of the view for him in part is that as he looks, he says to himself, I'm not going to remember this. And it adds this like pathos and ephemerality to it. So then after the fact, when he does remember it, it means it's like impossible to remember, because it means that in fact that experience was falsified by what came after it. And so it's another example of the way that your experience of the present, when he sees that skyline, is actually shot through with his projection about the future, that he won't remember it. And then in the future, his ability to remember the past, right, is nullified by this new knowledge, narrative knowledge that he's achieved. So, really the book is hugely about the way the story we tell about the future inheres in the present. And that even being present to a certain degree, like he was present to see that beautiful skyline, has to do with telling a story about the future, like that this moment doesn't have a future, so I'm going to value it with a kind of plenitude that it wouldn't otherwise possess. So it gets at this kind of contradiction about how experience is always caught up in it's a fiction that we're telling about the future.